The Islamic Republic of Iran has just lost what may have been its most powerful strategic weapon. Not on a battlefield, not through a missile strike, not in a naval confrontation in the Gulf, but through a quiet decision signed on paper in Abu Dhabi. And the regime in Tehran never saw it coming. While Iranian forces were launching thousands of missiles and drones across the region, they were not watching the real shift taking place behind the scenes. A shift that did not involve explosions, but consequences far more permanent than any airstrike. On May 1st, 2026, the United Arab Emirates officially exited OPEC after nearly 6 decades of membership. A single institutional decision, but one with global consequences. And with that exit, Iran lost something it had relied on for more than 40 years. Its ability to use the Strait of Hormuz as a geopolitical pressure tool over the world economy. For decades, Iran's strategy was built on a simple but powerful idea. If it felt cornered, it could threaten to close the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow waterway carries roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply. If blocked, global markets would panic, prices would spike, and international pressure would force negotiations. It was Iran's ultimate leverage point. Every sanctions cycle, every military buildup by the United States, every escalation in the region eventually met the same response from Tehran, a warning that the strait could be shut down. And for years, that warning worked. Oil markets reacted. Governments listened. Strategic decisions were shaped around that risk. To make that threat credible, Iran invested heavily in military infrastructure across the northern Gulf. Fast attack boats were deployed along the coastline. Anti-ship missile systems were placed on key islands and coastal positions. Submarine units operated in shallow waters. Naval mines were developed and reportedly deployed in limited numbers during periods of escalation. The entire doctrine of the IRGC Navy was built around one objective: make the Strait of Hormuz too dangerous to use. But that strategy depended on one assumption, that all Gulf oil had to pass through that choke point. That assumption is now broken because the UAE spent years building a completely different route. The Habshan Fujairah pipeline, also known as ADCOP, stretches roughly 380 kilometers from oil fields in Abu Dhabi directly to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. Unlike the Strait of Hormuz route, this pipeline completely bypasses Iranian-controlled waters. It allows oil to be loaded directly into tankers in the Gulf of Oman, outside the reach of Iranian naval forces. From there, shipments can move freely into the Indian Ocean without passing through the strait at all. This was not a theoretical backup plan. It was built as a strategic escape route. Before the current conflict escalated, the UAE was already exporting around 1.7 million barrels per day through Fujairah. But as tensions increased and the Strait of Hormuz became more dangerous, those exports surged by nearly 57%. The pipeline is now operating close to maximum capacity. And the UAE's energy company ADNOC has openly stated ambitions to reach up to 5 million barrels per day of total production capacity by 2027. That number changes everything because it means that even if Iran threatens the strait, even if naval forces attempt to disrupt shipping, even if escalation continues, a significant portion of Gulf oil no longer depends on that route at all. And that removes the very foundation of Iran's leverage strategy. What used to be a geographic choke point is now becoming optional. Iran's military doctrine, built over decades, is now aimed at a waterway that major regional producers are increasingly avoiding. Fast boats, missile batteries, mine, warfare systems, all designed for a choke point that is slowly losing its importance in global energy logistics. Meanwhile, the UAE is preparing for a post-OPEC future where it no longer needs to coordinate production quotas. Once the strait stabilizes or reopens fully, it can increase output immediately without waiting for collective approval or cartel negotiations. This is not just an energy shift. It is a structural dismantling of Iran's long-standing geopolitical advantage. And it all accelerated after one critical moment: Iranian missile strikes on UAE territory. In the months leading up to this decision, Iran launched thousands of missiles and drones across the region. And unlike previous conflicts focused primarily on Israel or Western military assets, the UAE was also directly targeted. In fact, it was hit harder than many expected. Industrial zones in Fujairah were struck. Infrastructure near Jebel Ali port was affected. Even areas around Dubai experienced disruptions and visible damage from nearby strikes. The UAE did not escalate publicly in response. It absorbed the attacks. It maintained silence at the political level, but internally, the response was very different. As one Emirati official later stated, you can't be attacked with 2,800 missiles and drones. And then talk about trust. That statement reflects a shift that is not emotional, it is structural. It signals that the relationship between Iran and the UAE is no longer operating under diplomatic assumptions. It is now operating under strategic separation. And the UAE's exit from OPEC is the formal expression of that break. Perhaps even more significant is how the decision was made. According to official statements, the UAE did not coordinate its exit with Saudi Arabia before announcing it. Riyadh learned of the move at the same time as the global public. For a system that has relied on Saudi leadership within OPEC for decades, this was not just unexpected. It was a signal that the internal unity of the cartel is no longer guaranteed. And that is where the real transformation begins. Because what looks like an energy policy decision is actually the beginning of a broader realignment in the Middle East, one where economic tools are replacing military leverage and where traditional pressure points are being systematically bypassed. This is not the end of the story. It is only the moment the system begins to break apart. What makes the UAE's decision even more significant is not just what it did, but what it triggered inside the wider Gulf system. Because OPEC was never only an energy organization. It was a political structure held together by shared production limits, negotiated pricing strategies, and an implicit balance of influence between Saudi Arabia, smaller Gulf states, and external partners. By leaving that structure, the UAE didn't simply exit a cartel. It disrupted a system that has shaped global oil markets for decades. And the reaction inside the region reveals how deep that disruption really goes. Saudi Arabia, which has traditionally acted as the central coordinator within OPEC, was not consulted before the UAE announcement. There was no formal coordination, no joint planning, no shared communication strategy. Riyadh reportedly learned of the decision through public reporting alongside everyone else. That detail matters more than it appears. Because within OPEC, Saudi Arabia has always functioned as the stabilizing core. Its influence over production quotas, pricing discipline, and negotiation strategy has defined the organization's direction since the Cold War era. If that coordination breaks, the entire structure becomes unstable, and instability is already beginning to show. Analysts quickly noted that the UAE's exit is not an isolated event. It is a precedent. And precedents inside OPEC matter more than almost anything else because the system depends on mutual restraint. Once one member successfully exits without catastrophic consequences, others begin to reassess their own position. That is why countries like Kazakhstan, Nigeria, and even Venezuela are now being discussed as potential flight risks within the organization. Kazakhstan has already been producing above its assigned quotas for months. Nigeria is increasingly focusing on domestic refining capacity rather than strict export coordination. Venezuela, though politically constrained, continues to operate outside normal production frameworks due to sanctions and internal instability. If even a small number of additional members begin to drift away from quota discipline, OPEC's influence over global supply becomes increasingly symbolic rather than practical. And that shift is already visible in the numbers. OPEC once controlled close to half of global oil production during its peak influence period. Today, that share is closer to 1/3 and gradually declining. The UAE's departure accelerates that decline not because of immediate volume loss, but because of structural confidence loss. Once coordination breaks, markets stop treating the group as a unified decision maker. They start treating it as individual producers acting independently. And that changes pricing behavior globally. But the most important part of the UAE decision is not what it removes from OPEC. It is what it enables outside of it. As long as the UAE was bound by production quotas, its ability to respond to geopolitical crises was limited. It could not rapidly increase output without negotiating within the cartel framework. It could not fully optimize production capacity without considering collective agreements. Now that constraint is gone, and that means the UAE can operate as a fully independent energy actor aligned directly with its own strategic partners, particularly the United States. However, it is important to understand the short-term limitation here. The UAE cannot immediately flood global markets with additional oil, even after leaving OPEC. Production is still constrained by physical infrastructure. Current output is approximately 2.37 million barrels per day, while sustainable capacity is estimated at around 4.3 million barrels per day. That gap represents nearly 2 million barrels per day of unused potential, but it cannot be accessed instantly. The key bottleneck is not policy, it is logistics. Most of the UAE's export flexibility depends on the Fujairah pipeline system, which is already operating near maximum capacity. And as long as the Strait of Hormuz remains contested or unstable, that pipeline becomes the central artery for all strategic exports. This is why analysts emphasize that the immediate market reaction to the UAE exit is limited. There is no sudden surge of oil entering global supply today. There is no immediate price collapse. The system has not physically changed overnight, but the long-term structure has, because the real impact begins when conditions change. The moment the Strait of Hormuz becomes fully accessible again, the UAE is positioned to increase production rapidly without waiting for OPEC consensus. That means millions of barrels per day of additional supply can enter the market far faster than traditional cartel systems would allow. And that creates a permanent shift in bargaining power. Iran's long-standing strategy depended on one critical assumption, that all major Gulf producers were constrained by the same transit vulnerability. If Iran could threaten the Strait, it could influence all exporters equally. That assumption no longer holds. The UAE now has a bypass, and that bypass is expanding. At the same time, external pressure on Iran's financial system is intensifying in parallel. On the same day as the UAE's OPEC exit, the United States Treasury Department expanded what it called Operation Economic Fury. This operation targeted 35 entities and individuals linked to Iran's shadow banking system, an extensive network used to move money internationally outside formal banking channels. These networks are essential to Iran's economy under sanctions. They facilitate oil sales, transfer funds to proxy organizations, purchase restricted components for military systems, and move regime-linked wealth across jurisdictions. Without them, Iran's ability to function internationally is severely constrained. The Treasury action froze more than $300 million in cryptocurrency assets connected to these networks in a single coordinated move. That figure is not just symbolic. It reflects a growing ability to track and disrupt digital financial flows that previously operated outside traditional enforcement mechanisms. But the most important detail is not the seizure itself. It is the level of cooperation now emerging between Washington and Gulf financial institutions, particularly in the UAE. For years, the UAE operated as a major hub for global capital flows, including opaque corporate structures that allowed beneficial ownership to remain hidden. The system, while not designed specifically for sanctions evasion, was widely used by Iranian-linked entities to move money through shell companies and offshore structures. That environment has now changed. Following direct attacks on UAE territory, cooperation between Emirati financial regulators and U.S. enforcement agencies has intensified significantly. This includes sharing corporate registry data, tracing ownership structures, and identifying previously concealed financial links. In practical terms, this means that networks which once operated quietly within the UAE's financial ecosystem, are now being systematically exposed. And for Iran, that is far more damaging than any single sanctions package, because it targets the infrastructure that keeps the system alive. Not just revenue, but movement, access, and liquidity. And while energy markets are adjusting slowly, the financial system is being reshaped in real time. What is now unfolding inside Iran's financial system is not a simple tightening of sanctions. It is a coordinated breakdown of the networks that have allowed the state to survive under pressure for decades. For years, Iran built a parallel financial world outside the formal global banking system. When traditional banking access was restricted, the regime adapted. It developed shadow banking routes, layered ownership structures, and offshore intermediaries that could move money across borders without direct detection. These systems became essential. They were not secondary tools, they were lifelines. They allowed Iran to sell oil despite sanctions, pay proxy groups across the region, import restricted components for military programs, and move elite wealth into stable foreign assets. Without them, the state's external operations would slow dramatically. And at the center of many of these channels were jurisdictions that offered flexible corporate structures and high-volume trade corridors, including the United Arab Emirates. For years, the UAE functioned as a critical transit hub for global capital flows. It was not a rogue system, it was a global one. But within that system, opacity was possible. Companies could be registered with complex ownership layers. Beneficial owners were not always publicly visible. Financial flows could be structured through intermediaries that made ultimate control difficult to trace. Iranian-linked entities used these conditions extensively. Shell companies registered in Emirati jurisdictions were used to receive payments for oil sold under sanctions. Funds were then redirected through layered transactions into accounts connected to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated organizations. From there, money moved into regional proxy networks and procurement channels. This system did not operate in isolation. It existed because enforcement pressure was limited by economic interdependence. The cost of aggressively policing every transaction was high, and the volume of global capital passing through the UAE made selective enforcement difficult. That balance has now shifted. The turning point was not a policy statement. It was the escalation of direct attacks on Emirati territory. Once the UAE itself became a target of Iranian missile and drone strikes, the political calculus changed fundamentally. At that point, tolerance for ambiguity in financial enforcement decreased sharply. And the result is visible in the latest actions taken by the U.S. Treasury. Under Operation Economic Fury, 35 entities and individuals were designated as part of Iran's shadow banking infrastructure. These are not minor operators. They include financial facilitators, intermediaries, and network managers responsible for coordinating large-scale money movement across borders. At the same time, more than $300 million in cryptocurrency assets linked to Iranian financial networks were frozen in a single coordinated enforcement action. This is not just about freezing funds. It represents an evolution in enforcement capability. Cryptocurrency was once seen as a parallel system that could bypass traditional financial oversight. But tracing tools, blockchain analysis, and international coordination have significantly reduced that advantage. What was once opaque is now increasingly visible. And when visibility increases, vulnerability increases with it. But the most important shift is not technological. It is political cooperation between enforcement actors and regional financial hubs. For years, the UAE's position was carefully balanced. It maintained openness as a global financial center while also managing complex relationships with regional actors, including Iran. That balance allowed significant economic activity to flow through its system without direct confrontation. That equilibrium has now been disrupted. After sustained attacks, cooperation between Emirati financial regulators and U.S. enforcement agencies has intensified significantly. This includes deeper sharing of financial intelligence, corporate ownership data, and transaction-level information. In practical terms, this means that networks, which previously relied on structural opacity within Emirati jurisdictions, are now exposed to coordinated tracking and identification. For Iran, this is a structural problem, not a tactical one, because the issue is no longer just sanctions enforcement. It is the erosion of the financial architecture that allowed sanctions to be bypassed in the first place. And that architecture is being dismantled layer by layer. At the same time, Iran's domestic financial stress is increasing rapidly. Revenue losses from energy constraints are compounding daily. Estimates suggest hundreds of millions of dollars per day in lost oil income due to production disruptions, export limitations, and forced operational shutdowns in key fields. These losses are not theoretical. They directly affect state liquidity, budget planning, and the ability to fund external operations. When combined with tightened financial enforcement abroad, the pressure becomes multi-directional. Money is not only harder to earn, it is harder to move. And that distinction is critical because regimes under sanctions do not collapse simply because revenue declines. They collapse when liquidity systems break, when money cannot circulate efficiently through the networks that sustain governance, security, and external influence. That is what makes the current phase different. The pressure is no longer isolated to one sector. It is simultaneous across energy, finance, and logistics. And it is accelerating. Inside Iran's security establishment, internal assessments reportedly acknowledge that operational sustainability is now measured in weeks rather than months under current conditions. While such figures are often contested, the broader point is clear. The system is under time compression. Every week of constrained revenue and restricted financial movement reduces strategic flexibility. Every enforcement action reduces available channels. Every infrastructure shift in the Gulf reduces leverage. And all of it is happening at once. At the same time, external actors are adapting their behavior in response. China, one of the largest buyers of Iranian crude under discounted arrangements, is now reassessing its exposure. For years, Chinese refiners benefited from purchasing sanctioned Iranian oil at lower prices, often routed through complex shipping networks designed to obscure origin and bypass enforcement. But that system is becoming increasingly risky. Interdiction efforts in international waters have expanded. Tankers associated with sanctioned oil flows are being tracked, seized, or sanctioned. Refining entities linked to these supply chains are being directly designated by U.S. authorities. This increases legal and operational risk for buyers. And when risk increases, demand behavior changes. At the same time, alternative supply sources are becoming more attractive. The UAE, now outside OPEC constraints and increasingly aligned with Western enforcement frameworks, offers a contrasting model. Stable production, legal clarity, and predictable shipping routes outside contested maritime zones. This creates a structural choice for importers. Maintain exposure to sanctioned, high-risk supply chains or shift toward more stable, enforceable alternatives. And that choice is not ideological. It is logistical, which means over time, it tends to move in one direction. At this stage, the most important shift is not just financial or diplomatic. It is military, and more specifically, the collapse of a long-standing deterrence model that Iran has relied on for decades. For more than 40 years, the Islamic Republic built its regional strategy around one central idea: control uncertainty in the Strait of Hormuz. Not full control, not permanent closure, just enough credible threat to make global energy markets react. That alone was enough to give Iran strategic weight far beyond its conventional military capacity. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, but it carries nearly 1/5 of global oil exports. That concentration made it one of the most sensitive maritime choke points in the world. And Iran understood that better than anyone. Its naval doctrine in the Persian Gulf was designed around asymmetric disruption. Instead of competing with advanced navies ship for ship, Iran invested in systems that could make navigation risky and expensive. Fast attack boats were deployed to swarm larger vessels. Coastal missile batteries were positioned along key points of the northern Gulf. Mobile radar and surveillance systems tracked commercial shipping lanes. Submarine and underwater warfare capabilities were developed for low visibility engagement scenarios. And mine warfare, in particular, became a central part of its deterrence planning. The logic was simple. If Iran could not dominate the strait, it could still make it unusable. Even the possibility of disruption was enough to move oil prices. For decades, this worked. But what has changed now is not Iran's capability. It is the environment those capabilities depend on. The UAE's new export infrastructure fundamentally reduces the effectiveness of strait-based leverage. The Habshan Fujairah pipeline allows oil to bypass Hormuz entirely, moving directly to the Gulf of Oman. That single structural shift means that even if maritime disruption increases, not all Gulf oil is affected equally. This breaks the assumption behind Iran's deterrence model that all regional energy flows are equally vulnerable. They are no longer, and once a deterrence system becomes uneven, its credibility weakens. Because deterrence is not only about force, it is about belief. If markets, governments, and producers begin to believe that disruption no longer produces universal pressure, the strategic value of that disruption declines rapidly. That is what is now unfolding. The UAE's infrastructure investment did not eliminate the Strait of Hormuz as a geographic reality, but it reduced its strategic monopoly over global energy transit. And that is enough to change behavior. At the same time, military escalation has produced unintended political consequences inside the Gulf. The missile and drone attacks directed at UAE territory did not lead to a unified regional retaliation in the way Iran may have expected. Instead, they triggered a more structural response: economic decoupling, financial tightening, and institutional realignment. The UAE absorbed the initial strikes, but its response was not immediate military escalation. It was systemic restructuring. Leaving OPEC was part of that response. So it was deeper cooperation with U.S. financial enforcement. So it's a shift toward infrastructure that bypasses traditional choke points. This is important because it shows a change in the nature of conflict in the region. It is no longer primarily kinetic. It is increasingly institutional. Instead of direct confrontation between militaries, the more decisive actions are happening through pipelines, financial networks, trade alignment, and regulatory cooperation. And in that environment, traditional forms of leverage become less effective. Even Iran's most familiar tool threatening regional shipping now competes with alternative logistics networks that are less vulnerable to disruption. At the same time, the broader regional response is becoming clearer. The Gulf Cooperation Council's unified statements rejecting unilateral control over the strait signal that regional actors are no longer willing to accept any single state dictating access to global energy routes. Combined with increased coordination with Western financial systems, this represents a gradual consolidation of an alternative energy security framework, one that is less dependent on Iranian compliance or restraint. And that brings the system to a critical point, because Iran's strategy was never just about military capacity. It was about interdependence. The assumption that others needed the same routes, the same choke points, the same systems of vulnerability, that assumption is breaking down. And when interdependence breaks, leverage disappears. Internally, Iran is now facing the combined pressure of reduced oil revenue, constrained export capacity, and restricted financial movement. These are not separate issues. They reinforce each other. Less revenue means less capacity to sustain external operations. Less financial access means less ability to move remaining revenue efficiently. Less operational freedom means reduced geopolitical influence. And all of this is happening while alternative supply systems are expanding elsewhere. China, which once absorbed discounted Iranian crude through complex and semi-covert channels, is now increasingly exposed to enforcement risk in those same supply chains. As tankers are tracked and designated, and as refineries face sanctions pressure, the cost of continuing those arrangements rises. At the same time, legally stable Gulf supply becomes more attractive. This is not a political realignment driven by ideology. It is a logistical recalculation driven by risk. And logistics, over time, tends to override politics, which brings the situation into its final structural outcome. Iran's most powerful strategic instrument was never a missile system or a proxy network. It was the assumption that it could impose costs on the global economy through control of a choke point. That assumption is now being systematically reduced by infrastructure bypasses, financial enforcement, and shifting trade patterns. Not eliminated overnight, but weakened step by step. And as that happens, the strategic environment that once allowed Iran to translate regional influence into global pressure is dissolving. What replaces it is not yet fully defined. But what is clear is this. The system Iran relied on to project power is no longer operating under the same conditions. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer an absolute constraint. OPEC is no longer a unified structure. Shadow banking is no longer opaque. And regional alignment is no longer static. Each layer that once reinforced Iran's strategic leverage is now under pressure from a different direction. And together, they are producing the same outcome. A system that is no longer stable enough to sustain its previous balance of power. This is Professor John, and what we are witnessing is not a single event. It is the restructuring of an entire regional order, one layer at a time.